Hello everybody and welcome to History Bite number 120, dated December 2nd, 2020. I'm Walter, your mobile historian and blue-collar scholar. This History Bite is entitled, The Original Intent of the Second Amendment. Now, the Second Amendment, of course, is one of the most popular provisions in the Bill of Rights, interpreted today as protecting the right to keep and bear arms for self-defense inside the home. The Second Amendment, however, being intellectually honest, was not intended for that purpose. By stark contrast, the Second Amendment was a provision, like most of the Bill of Rights, if not all of them, that was designed to allay the fears of Americans against an all-powerful central government. Indeed, the specific purpose of the Second Amendment essentially was to prohibit Congress from destroying the state militias. The state militias were, of course, the private militaries of the individual states, that were under the authority of the state governments. These militias were seen as the essential defenders of the liberty of the American people against an all-powerful federal army that might possibly destroy that liberty. These militias, beyond that, of course, had other purposes, which we'll get to in a moment. But with respect to the militias per se, and how the amendment is interpreted today, the Second Amendment did not, nor was it created in any way, protect, the right to keep and bear arms outside of service in a militia. It did not protect an individual right to keep weapons, for personal use, for personal defense, outside of service in a militia. And if you do your research, you will see just how important militias were to early Americans, and you will understand that in the context that it was used at the time, bearing arms was hardly ever stated unless it was in the context of military service. So the notion that the right to keep and bear arms, was something naturally ordered by the Second Amendment as a personal right is both historically inaccurate and just outright dishonest. The amendment was never intended to convey a personal right to keep and bear arms, but instead it was designed to protect the state militias from destruction by the Congress, so that these militias could serve as a check to an all-powerful federal army in case the federal government decided at some point it was going to attempt to destroy the freedoms of the people via its military power. State militias would therefore then be able to be called into service to defend the people. Now, to these militias, all of the states had such militias, and of course they were simply the whole body of men in the state who were likely between the ages of 18 to maybe 45, white males, of course. You already know that African Americans and Native American men were excluded from such service. And these militias they varied greatly with their level of organization. Some were highly organized, some not so much. But in any case, their primary purpose was to serve the state and protect the state, And of course, that protection was aimed at a potentially tyrannical federal government. But that wasn't the only thing those militias were designed to shield against. As I said before, militias prohibited, the service of African American men and Native American men. One reason for those militias, that's rarely talked about today, of course, was to keep these groups in check. Hardly any of the original states allowed African Americans, whether enslaved or free, to bear arms in any way, shape, or form. So that throws out the argument from the beginning that it was intended to protect an individual right to keep and bear arms, Even if that argument could be made, it certainly was not extended to people of color, Those militias had an inherent, and implied power position to keep non-whites in check in the states, and they certainly perform that duty. All right. You know, these militias were also designed essentially to prevent violence in the states, but rebellions is what I'm referring to. But ironically, rebellions were overwhelmingly tolerated by state militias as long as it was whites engaging in the rebellion. Now, when they happened to be commenced by blacks, mainly enslaved blacks, or Native Americans, that was a different story. All right. So these militias obviously were designed to maintain the white supremacist power structure as well. And so it was thought to be highly important to protect the ability of those militias to do just that. That's another reason for the Second Amendment. Okay. The way the amendment is interpreted today, to protect an individual right to keep and bear arms inside the home for defense, is a very modern, okay, facade, a very modern covering over the amendment, I should say, because that was not the intent of the Second Amendment. It was never designed to protect a personal right to keep and bear arms, okay, outside of service in a militia, okay, and all of the states. So people who are completely anti-gun control, listen to this. All of the states had laws limiting who could and could not bear arms, folks. And the Second Amendment did absolutely nothing to invalidate such laws. Why? Because it was never intended to do so. The Second Amendment was merely designed to protect the state militias so that those militias could serve in a protective capacity in numerous ways. All right. So it was never intended to protect a personal right to keep and bear arms. Okay. The way the Supreme Court has interpreted it today is a modern cover on that amendment. All right. It is essentially a new coat of paint. All right. Repurposing it for the 21st century. All right. But that was not its historic intent. That historic intent was to preserve the state militias. If we're going to be intellectually honest, let's do so and acknowledge that the Second Amendment, though today obviously protects an individual right to keep and bear arms inside the home for self-defense, of course, that too is subject to various regulations from state to state. But that was not its purpose. That was not its intent. But instead, to protect the state militias from destruction, militias that were, at least in theory, designed to protect the liberty of the American people against an all-powerful federal government. Let's be historically honest. Let's interpret things correctly. All right? So that concludes this video on the original intent of the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. All right. I thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions or controversies, please leave them down below and I'll be happy to answer them. If you have not subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do so. Your support is greatly appreciated. Take care, stay safe out there, and I'll talk to you at the next History Bite. Peace.